3 days before Rose Calloway discovered she was the daughter of a billionaire, she was living in room 114 of a rundown motel with her 7-year-old daughter. 3 days before she inherited property worth tens of millions of dollars, she was counting quarters to buy breakfast. And 3 days before a team of corporate lawyers began trying to stop her from opening a storage unit, she had never even heard the name Gerald Harwick. But on a cold Tuesday afternoon, a certified letter arrived at the front desk of the Eastgate Motel. Inside was a message that made absolutely no sense. A billionaire she had never met had died, and according to his will, everything now depended on what was hidden inside Storage Unit 41. Rose had no idea that opening that metal door would uncover a secret buried for 37 years. A secret involving her mother, a stolen fortune, corporate fraud, and a truth powerful enough to change her life forever. But before that letter arrived, Rose was just trying to survive another day. She lay on the thin mattress that took up most of the floor in room 114 of the Eastgate Motel, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had slowly grown over the past 3 weeks into the shape of something that looked almost like a hand reaching downward. She had started thinking of it as a sign, though a sign of what, she couldn't say. Maybe just a sign that the roof was leaking again and the management didn't care enough to fix it. That felt about right. The room smelled like old carpet and the ghost of someone else's takeout. The single window faced a concrete wall. During the day, a thin bar of gray light crept along the floor from about 10 a.m. to noon, and then it was gone again. Rose had learned to measure her mornings by that light. She turned her head slowly to the right. Her daughter, Maya, was still asleep on the other side of the mattress, one small arm thrown over her eyes, her dark curls fanned out against the pillow. 7 years old, still small enough to sleep like she had not a single worry in the world. Rose watched her breathe for a long moment, watched the tiny rise and fall of her chest. That was the only thing that made sense anymore. That breathing, that small chest. Rose sat up carefully, trying not to shift the mattress too much, and put her feet on the cold linoleum floor. She reached for the phone on the floor beside her. 5:47 a.m. She had to be at the diner by 6:30. She had exactly 43 minutes to shower in a bathroom where the hot water worked maybe 60% of the time, dress herself, dress Maya without waking her yet, walk her 3 blocks to the church daycare that opened at 6, and then walk another 8 blocks to the Sunrise Diner on Fletcher Avenue where she had been waitressing for the past 11 months. She stood up slowly, bones aching in a way that didn't seem right for a 31-year-old body. The thing about being poor that nobody who had never been poor truly understood, it wasn't just the money. It was the weight. Not a metaphorical weight, but a physical, cellular exhaustion that lived in your joints and your spine and the backs of your eyes. It was the weight of calculating everything. Every dollar, every meal, every bus token. Every time someone at the diner left a bad tip, Rose would do the math in her head before the customer had even reached the door. She couldn't help it. Her mind had become a kind of desperate calculator that never turned off. She padded to the bathroom and turned the shower handle. Cold. She waited. Still cold. She turned it as far as it would go and stepped back, hugging herself, waiting. 30 seconds later, something between lukewarm and cold came through, and she stepped in anyway. She had stopped waiting for hot water sometime around November. As she stood under the weak stream, she thought about the phone call she had gotten yesterday. From the county housing office. The woman on the phone had been professional and not unkind, which somehow made it worse. Miss Calloway, I want to be transparent with you. The waiting list for Section 8 vouchers in this county currently has a 2 to 3 year estimated wait. I know that's not what you were hoping to hear. Rose had been standing in the back alley behind the diner on her 10-minute break when the call came. She had pressed her back against the brick wall and looked up at the gray February sky and said, "Okay. Thank you." Because what else was there to say? 2 to 3 years. She turned off the shower and dried herself with a towel that had gone rough from too many washings without fabric softener. She had been at the Eastgate Motel for 63 days. Before that, 3 weeks in her car, a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear window, sheets sealed with packing tape. Before that, a room in a house share in the Milburn neighborhood, until her roommate's boyfriend moved in and things had gotten uncomfortable and then unsafe, and she had left at 2 in the morning with Maya on her hip and 2 bags over her shoulder. Before all of that, there had been an apartment. A real one, with a couch and a kitchen table and Maya's drawings taped to the refrigerator. And before that, before the layoff, before Daniel left, before the medical bills from Maya's ear surgery that had eaten through every cent of savings she'd managed to build, there had been something that looked, from a distance, like a normal life. Rose looked at herself briefly in the bathroom mirror, then looked away. She didn't like doing that in the morning. It took too much out of her. She got Maya up at 6:10. Her daughter woke slowly, the way children do, blinking and warm, and Rose held her face in both hands for a moment and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Maya's eyes were brown and clear, and she looked at her mother with that absolute, uncomplicated trust that children have, and Rose felt it like a blade behind her sternum, gentle and devastating at the same time. "Is it a pancake day?" Maya asked, voice still thick with sleep. "Not today, baby, but soon." It was the same answer Rose had been giving for 3 weeks. Maya had stopped asking for clarification. They walked the 3 blocks to the church daycare in the pale early morning cold, Rose carrying Maya's backpack and holding her hand, listening to her daughter talk about a dream she'd had about a purple horse that could fly. Rose listened carefully. She asked questions. She laughed in the right places. This was the performance she gave every morning. The performance of a mother who was fine, who had things under control, who would make everything okay. She was very good at it. She dropped Maya at the daycare door, kissed her once more, and then turned and walked the 8 blocks to the diner alone, hands in the pockets of her coat, jaw tight against the cold. At the Sunrise Diner, the morning rush started at 7 and didn't let up until 9:30. Rose moved through it the way she always did, efficiently, quietly, with a smile that she could put on and take off like a piece of clothing. She refilled coffee cups. She remembered orders without writing them down. She apologized for things that were not her fault. She smiled at the man at table 4 who always left 11% and never looked at her directly. She smiled at the woman at table 7 who sent her eggs back twice and spoke to her like she was slow. She smiled. At 8:15, during a brief lull, her manager Dennis came out from the back and stopped beside her near the coffee station. "Rose," he said, without looking at her. He was studying the order sheet on his clipboard. "I'm going to need you to pick up the Sunday closing shift going forward." Marta put in her notice. Rose kept her face neutral. Sunday closing meant she wouldn't get back to the motel until nearly midnight. Maya would be alone. "I can't do Sunday closing," she said quietly. "My daughter." I know. Dennis finally looked up, and his expression was not cruel, but it was final in the way that only men who have never had to worry about childcare can be final. "But I need someone reliable on that shift. If it's not you, I need to rethink the schedule entirely." The threat was soft-spoken and clear. "I'll figure it out," Rose said. "Good." He went back to his clipboard. She stood at the coffee station for a moment, staring at the machine, listening to it drip. Figure it out. How many times had she said those 3 words to herself over the past 2 years? They had become a kind of prayer, a mantra, a small fist raised at a very large sky. She would figure it out. She always did. That was what no one around her seemed to understand. She was not a woman who had given up. She was a woman who had been pushed so far past the point where most people would have given up that giving up had simply stopped being an option. She got up every morning. She put on the smile. She moved through the shift. She picked up Maya. She did homework at the motel table. She made dinner on the single hot plate she wasn't supposed to have in the room. She told bedtime stories. She turned off the light. And then she lay in the dark and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. And she did it all again. That Tuesday, the letter arrived. She almost missed it. The motel didn't have individual mailboxes. There was a front desk, and the clerk, a tired young man named Garrett, held mail for residents and usually forgot to mention it. Rose only stopped at the desk because she noticed Garrett holding something out toward her as she passed through the lobby after her shift. "Something came for you," he said. "Certified. You had to sign. I signed for you. Hope that's okay." Rose took the envelope from him. It was cream-colored, heavier than normal paper, with a return address that meant nothing to her. A law firm, Blackwell and Associates, Portland, Oregon. She stood in the lobby and stared at it. Her first thought was that it was a debt collector trying something new. Her second thought was that it was some kind of mistake. Her third thought, which she pushed away almost immediately because she had learned a long time ago not to let hope get any traction before she had reason for it, was that it might be something else entirely. She took it upstairs. She sat on the edge of the mattress. She opened it carefully, the way you open something that might be fragile. The letter was 2 pages long, printed on stiff, high-quality paper with the law firm's name embossed at the top. Rose read it once quickly, understanding only pieces. Then she read it again, more slowly, her lips moving slightly. By the 3rd time through, she understood enough to feel the floor shift slightly beneath her. The letter informed her that a man named Gerald Harwick, she had never heard this name in her life, had passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 78. Gerald Harwick had been, according to the letter, a real estate developer and investor of significant means based in Portland, Oregon. He had left a will. The will had been through the standard probate process. And buried in that will, in what the letter described as a specific bequest, was a single line that named Rose and Calloway as the sole inheritor of storage unit number 41 at a facility called Pacific Rim Storage, located at 8800 Harbor View Road, Portland, Oregon. Rose read that line 4 times. A storage unit. A storage unit belonging to a man she had never heard of. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she turned the page. The second page was a brief explanatory note from the attorney handling the estate, a man named Douglas Blackwell, stating that she would need to present the enclosed authorization letter at the facility and provide identification, and that the unit had been prepaid through the end of the month, after which ongoing fees would become her responsibility if she wished to retain it. At the very bottom of the page, in a small paragraph that had the careful, measured tone of someone trying not to say very much while technically saying something, Douglas Blackwell had written, "I would strongly encourage you, Ms. Calloway, not to make any hasty decisions regarding the contents of the unit before seeking legal counsel. The estate has generated considerable interest from various parties. Please feel free to contact our office directly should you have questions." Rose read that paragraph 3 times. Considerable interest from various parties. She put the letter down on the mattress and looked at the ceiling. She didn't know a Gerald Harwick. She had never been to Portland, Oregon. She had no idea what a storage unit she had never known about could possibly contain. For all she knew, it was full of old furniture and broken appliances, the kind of sad accumulation that a life leaves behind. For all she knew, she was going to spend money. She didn't have to travel to Oregon to claim a unit full of garbage that would cost her more to deal with than it was worth. That was almost certainly what it was. She told herself that very firmly. But she picked up the letter again and read that last paragraph one more time. Considerable interest from various parties. She lay back on the mattress, the letter resting on her chest, and stared at the water stain that looked like a hand reaching down. For the first time in a very long time, since before the car, before the motels, before any of it, she felt something she didn't have a name for right away. It took her several minutes to identify it. It was the feeling of something possibly, impossibly, terrifyingly beginning. She made 2 phone calls the next morning. The first was to the law firm. The woman who answered was polite and efficient and told her that Mr. Blackwell was in meetings, but that yes, the letter was legitimate, and yes, the bequest was valid, and yes, they had confirmed her identity through records provided to the estate. When Rose asked how Gerald Harwick had known her name, the woman paused for just a moment, the kind of pause that is one breath too long, and said, "Mr. Blackwell would be better suited to answer that. I'll have him call you." He never called. The second call was to her sister, Patricia, who lived in Beaverton, Oregon, 40 minutes south of Portland. Patricia and Rose had a complicated relationship built on love and distance, and the particular tension that forms between 2 sisters who grew up in the same poverty and escaped it at different speeds. Patricia had married well. Not rich, but stable. House, car, 2 kids in a school district with a good rating. She and Rose spoke maybe once a month, the calls warm but carefully bounded, the way calls are when one person has more than the other and both people are trying not to make it strange. "You're serious," Patricia said when Rose explained. "A storage unit. That's what the letter says. From a man you've never heard of. Gerald Harwick." A pause. "That name doesn't mean anything to me either." "I know." Rose was quiet for a moment. "I want to come see it. I want to at least go look at it before I decide anything." Another pause, longer this time. "You can stay here. Of course you can stay here. You and Maya both." Patricia's voice carried the particular warmth of genuine offer and the particular tightness of someone recalculating their week. When were you thinking? As soon as I can manage the bus tickets. She managed them 4 days later. 41 hours on a Greyhound bus from the Midwest to the Pacific Northwest, Rose and Maya in a window seat with a bag of snacks and Maya's backpack full of crayons and small toys and a library book about dolphins. Maya slept against Rose's shoulder for long stretches. Rose watched the country change through the window, flat into hills, brown into gray into green, and held the letter in her lap and read it one more time, as if something new might appear in it. Nothing new appeared, but she read it anyway. Patricia's house was warm and smelled like dinner, and her husband Carl shook Rose's hand with the careful kindness of a man trying to make up for something that wasn't his fault, and their 2 kids pulled Maya immediately into the living room to show her something on a tablet. And for a few minutes Rose stood in the entryway of her sister's home and felt the particular grief of watching someone else's normal life from the outside. You look tired, Patricia said, hugging her. I'm okay. You always say that. I know. They ate dinner together, a real dinner, at a table, with serving dishes and cloth napkins, and afterward Patricia put the kids to bed and poured 2 glasses of wine, and they sat at the kitchen table together, and Rose told her everything. All of it. Not just the storage unit, but the motel, the waiting list, the diner, Sunday closing shifts, Maya asking about pancakes. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode. When Rose finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't you tell me? She said finally. Her voice was careful. Because I was handling it. Rose. I was. Rose looked at her wine glass. I am. Patricia didn't push. That was the thing about the 2 of them. They had learned, a long time ago, exactly how hard to push and exactly when to stop. Okay, she said softly. So, tomorrow, the storage unit. Tomorrow, Rose agreed. She slept that night in Patricia's guest room, in a real bed, with real sheets, and Maya curled beside her making the soft sounds that children make when they finally feel safe. And Rose lay in the dark and felt the strangeness of the day pressing around her like water. Who was Gerald Harwick? Why did he know her name? What was in that unit? She was still asking those questions when sleep finally took her. Pacific Rim Storage on Harborview Road was not the kind of facility you would notice if you weren't looking for it. It sat on a flat industrial stretch of road on the southeastern edge of Portland, flanked on one side by a tire wholesaler and on the other by a chain-link fence beyond which a field of scrub grass faded into a fog bank coming off the harbor. The building itself was low and beige, the kind of beige that was trying very hard not to be a color, with a single-story office attached to a long corridor of roll-up metal doors that disappeared around the corner of the building. Rose stood in the parking lot for a moment before going in, turning up the collar of her coat against the damp cold that Portland does differently than the Midwest, wetter, somehow, and quieter. There were 3 other cars in the lot. A pickup, an older sedan, and a black Mercedes that seemed to be wearing the lot like a costume. She noticed the Mercedes. She didn't know why. She just noticed it. Inside the office, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Frank looked at her authorization letter, looked at her ID, looked at her, and then without much ceremony handed her a key on a numbered tag and pointed her in the direction of the corridor. Unit 41's around the second corner, he said. You'll see the numbers on the doors. Light switch is on the wall inside. Thank you. She turned to go. Ma'am. She turned back. Frank was looking at her with a slightly odd expression, not unfriendly, but careful, the expression of someone choosing words. You had some people asking about that unit yesterday. Stopped in. I told them it was privately owned and I couldn't help them. But they left a card. He slid a business card across the counter toward her. Just thought you should know. Rose picked up the card. It was thick, heavy stock, the kind of card that communicated money without saying a word. It read, Meridian Asset Partners. Below that, a name, Colton Vance, Director of Acquisitions. And below that, a phone number and an email and a website. She turned the card over. On the back, in neat handwriting, someone had written, If you're the new owner, please call us before you make any decisions. This is important. We can make this very easy for you. Rose read it twice. Then she put it in her pocket and walked toward the corridor. The corridor was long and narrow and lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed with the particular frequency of institutional insomnia. The doors on either side were identical, gray metal roll-ups with padlock hasps, each one stamped with a number in black paint. The air smelled like concrete dust and something faintly metallic, and underneath both of those, the ghost of something she couldn't quite identify. Old paper, maybe, or old wood. The smell of stored time. She rounded the first corner. Numbers in the 30s. She kept walking. She rounded the second corner and stopped. There was a man standing in front of Unit 41. He wasn't doing anything obviously wrong. He was just standing there, hands in the pockets of a very expensive-looking coat, looking at the locked door. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and he was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, maybe, with the clean, confident face of someone who had been told yes by the world so many times that the word no had become a novelty to him. He looked at her with an expression that shifted, in the space of about 1 second, from surprise to calibrated warmth. "Miss Calloway," he said. She stopped about 10 feet from him. "Who are you?" "Colton Vance." He smiled and extended a hand. "Meridian Asset Partners. I left a card at the—" "I have it." She didn't take his hand. "This is a private storage facility." "How did you know I was here today?" Something crossed his face, so fast she almost missed it, something that wasn't quite the smoothness he was projecting. Then it was gone. "We've been monitoring the estate proceedings," he said. "Standard due diligence. We're interested in acquiring the contents of this unit, and we wanted to reach you before you made any decisions. I think if we could talk for just a few minutes." "Not right now," Rose said. "Miss Calloway, I really think—" "I said not right now." Her voice was even and quiet, and something in it, some density, made him stop. She had spent 2 years developing a voice that could hold its own. "Waitresses learn it, or they don't survive. Please step back from the door." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped to the side, hands still in his pockets, the smile still in place but slightly recalibrated. Watching, Rose walked to the door of Unit 41. She looked at the padlock. Then she fit the key into it. Her hand was steady. She was somewhat proud of that. The lock opened. She grabbed the handle at the bottom of the roll-up door and pulled. It rose with the grinding, metallic protest of something that hadn't been opened in a long time. She reached around the inside of the frame, found the light switch Frank had mentioned, and clicked it on. The fluorescent light inside the unit flickered twice, stuttered, and then held. Rose stood in the doorway and looked at what Gerald Harwick had left her. The unit was maybe 10 feet wide and 20 feet deep. And it was full. Not crammed, not haphazardly packed the way storage units usually are, but full in the deliberate way of someone who had organized things carefully, perhaps long ago, and left them in a specific order. There were wooden shelving units along both walls, and on those shelves were boxes, all of them labeled in the same handwriting, a cramped and careful print. Cardboard boxes, plastic bins, a handful of wooden crates near the back that were older-looking, sealed with metal hardware. In the center of the space, there was a workbench of sorts, a folding table pushed against the back wall, and on it sat a metal lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox, and a single legal-sized manila envelope, sealed, with her name written on the front. Rose Calloway. Not Miss Calloway. Not Rose and Calloway. Just Rose Calloway, in the same cramped, careful handwriting as the boxes. She felt the back of her neck go cold. She was aware of Colton Vance still behind her in the corridor. She turned briefly. "Give me an hour," she said. "Ms. Calloway, if you just—" "An hour." She looked at him steadily. "Or I call the front office and have you removed." He held her gaze. Then he nodded, once, and stepped back. "I'll be outside," he said. "Please, don't sign anything without talking to us first." She turned back to the unit and stepped inside. The door of the unit didn't have a way to close from inside, so she moved to the back, as far from the entrance as she could get, and she stood before the table and looked at the envelope with her name on it. She picked it up, felt its weight. Something was inside, not papers, or not only papers. Something with a slight rigidity to it. She set it back down. She wasn't ready for that yet. She turned to the shelving units instead. The boxes were labeled in neat categories. Contracts, PRE, 1992. Architectural plans, Harbor District. Correspondence, personal. Photographs. Corporate records, HW Development Group. Land documentation, original. There were more, a dozen or more boxes, some labeled with years, some with names, some with words she didn't immediately understand. She pulled out one of the boxes labeled photographs and opened it. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, printed and sorted into smaller envelopes, each envelope dated in that same handwriting. She pulled out the envelope closest to the top. 1987, Harbor Project, Site 1. She opened it. The photographs were black and white, printed on the slightly glossy paper of professional development from that era. They showed a waterfront, cranes, mudflats, a half-constructed building frame, men in hard hats standing in groups. She didn't recognize the location, but there was something about it. The skyline in the background, the shape of the harbor. She put the photographs back and looked at another box. Correspondence, personal. She hesitated. Then she opened it. Inside were letters. Actual letters, paper, in envelopes. She lifted one out. The return address was not a business. It was a house, a street address in a neighborhood she didn't know, in Portland. She turned the envelope over. The letter inside was old. The postmark was 1989. She slid the paper out carefully. She read the first two lines. Her hand went still. The letter began, "Dear Gerald, I don't know how to tell you what I'm about to tell you, so I'm going to say it plainly. The child is yours." Rose lowered the letter slowly. She stood very still in the cold, fluorescent silence of Unit 41 and felt the world rearranging itself around her, molecule by molecule, into a shape she had not been expecting. The child is yours. She thought about her mother. Her mother who had died when Rose was 19 of a heart attack that nobody had seen coming. Her mother who had never, in all of Rose's childhood, spoken about Rose's father beyond a compressed, end-of-discussion silence that had taught Rose, very early, not to ask. Her mother whose maiden name was Calloway and whose first name had been June and who had worked as a bookkeeper for most of her working life and who had, for a period in the late 1980s that Rose only knew vaguely about, lived in Portland, Oregon, before returning to the Midwest. Portland, Oregon, the late 1980s. Rose put the letter down very carefully on the table beside the envelope with her name on it, and she pressed both hands flat on the surface and breathed. She was not a woman who fell apart. She had decided this about herself a long time ago. Falling apart was a luxury she had not been able to afford for years, and she had built, over those years, a particular kind of interior architecture, walls and supports and careful structures that kept everything functional even when everything was wrong. She called on those structures now. Breathe. Think. One thing at a time. She picked up the manila envelope with her name on it. She turned it over. On the back, sealed under the flap, there was a small piece of tape, and underneath the tape, a single line of that cramped handwriting. Rose, forgive me. Read this before anything else. Gee. She broke the seal. Inside the envelope were three things. The first was a letter, handwritten, for pages long. The second was a photograph, a single photograph, printed in color, showing a woman Rose recognized immediately as a younger version of her mother, and beside her, a man in his 40s she had never seen before who was looking at the camera with an expression that was complicated and tender in equal measure. The third thing was a small key, silver, much smaller than a house key, the kind of key that opens a safety deposit box. Rose looked at the photograph for a long time. She turned it over. On the back, in that same handwriting, neater, slower, like it had been written with great care, were the words, "June and me. Cannon Beach, 1989. The best summer. The only one." Rose sat down on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, because there was nowhere else to sit, and she started reading the letter. Gerald Harwick had known her mother for one summer. That was what the letter said, in the slow, careful language of an old man trying to be honest with time running out. He had met June Calloway when she was 26, and he was 37, newly divorced, running a development company that was, as he put it, in the process of becoming either something real or something that would ruin him, and he was not yet sure which. June had been working for the accounting firm that handled his books. They had fallen into something that he described, with an old man's precision, as the most important thing he had ever been too afraid to keep. He had ended it. She had moved away. He had not known about the pregnancy. He had not known Rose existed until 6 years ago, when a private investigation firm he had hired, Guilt, he wrote, has its own long clock, had confirmed what he had suspected when he found a letter June had started and never sent among old papers his accountant had returned to him. He had watched from a distance. He had not known how to approach. He had been afraid of being rejected, afraid of being too late, afraid of all the things that men who have spent their whole lives afraid of vulnerability are always afraid of. And then June had died and the chance was gone, and he had spent years trying to decide what to do about Rose, about the daughter he had never met. And in the end, he had done the only thing he felt he had the right to do. He had left her the unit. Because the unit, he wrote, is not just a storage unit. Rose read that line and felt the hair on her arms rise. He had written it carefully. He had wanted her to understand that it was not, or not only, an old man's sentimental gesture. The unit contains documentation, he wrote, and here his handwriting became slightly smaller, denser, as if he were trying to compress something that needed compressing, that relates to a property dispute that has been pending in the Oregon court system for 11 years. The property in question is a waterfront parcel in the Harbor District, approximately 4.3 acres, that I purchased in 1987 and which has been the subject of a legal challenge by a consortium of developers claiming that my original purchase documentation was fraudulent. I have never been able to prove otherwise because the original documents, the deed, the survey records, the correspondence with the county, and the signed purchase agreement have been missing from my files since 2013. I believe they were taken. I kept copies here, not because I knew this day would come, but because this place was the one storage space I kept that was not connected to my business name. The key in this envelope opens a lockbox on the back table. Everything inside that box is what I could not give the courts. Rose stopped reading. She sat on the floor of Unit 41 and looked at the lockbox on the table above her. Then she looked at the small silver key in her hand. She became aware, slowly, that her heart was beating very fast. She also became aware of something else. From somewhere further down the corridor outside, not close, but not far, she could hear voices. Two of them, Colton Vance and someone else. The someone else had a lower voice, authoritative, and she could not make out the words, but she could hear the cadence of the conversation, and it was the cadence of a plan being confirmed. She looked at the time on her phone. She had been in the unit for 38 minutes. She got up from the floor. She picked up the key. She put Gerald's letter and the photograph back in the envelope and tucked it inside her coat, against her body. Then she walked to the back table and looked at the lockbox. It was heavier than it looked. She tried to pick it up, and it didn't move easily. Not furniture heavy, but dense. She fit the small silver key into the lock on the front of the box, and she felt the mechanism engage, and she turned it. The lid opened. Inside, she found documents. A stack of them, wrapped in a cloth that had kept them dry and flat for God knows how long. She lifted the cloth carefully. Underneath were papers, actual paper documents, some handwritten, some typed on an old typewriter, some official-looking with stamps and signatures and seals. On top of the stack was a folded paper that she carefully opened. It was a property deed for 4.3 acres on the Portland waterfront, Harbor District, dated November 1987, signed and notarized. And below that was a county survey record. And below that was a signed purchase agreement. And below that, she stopped, because below all of it was a single sheet of paper that was not a legal document. It was a page torn from a notebook, handwritten, and the handwriting was not Gerald Harwick's cramped, careful print. It was different, flowing, and hasty, like someone who was afraid of being caught writing it. She read it. By the time she finished reading it, her hands had started to shake for the first time since she had entered the unit. The note was from someone named James Yates. She didn't know that name, but she recognized the other name in the note, the entity named, because it was the same name on the business card in her pocket. Meridian Asset Partners. The note described, in the hasty shorthand of someone writing quickly, a transaction, not a legal one, a payment, to a county records officer, for the removal of the original documentation of the 1987 purchase from the public record, because without those records, the deed could be challenged, and the parcel could be put back into play, and the consortium waiting to develop the Harbor District could move forward with their plans for what had, in the 11 years since Gerald Harwick bought the land in 1987, become some of the most valuable waterfront acreage on the West Coast. Rose read the note again. She stood in the back of the unit with her daughter's face in her mind, and the sound of Colton Vance's voice coming down the corridor and a dead man's letter inside her coat, and a lockbox full of documents that someone had been willing to commit fraud to keep from ever seeing a courtroom. And she felt something settle inside her like the way ground settles after a long rain. Not soft, but firm. Dense. Real. She closed the lockbox. She looked around the unit. She noted the wooden crates in the back corner, the older ones she hadn't opened yet. She noted the box labeled Land Documentation, Original. She noted the box labeled Architectural Plans, Harbor District. She was beginning to understand the scope of what she was standing inside. The voices in the corridor were louder now. She picked up the lockbox. It was heavy, but she could manage it, and she walked to the entrance of the unit. Colton Vance was standing at the corner of the corridor, and with him was a taller man in a suit, older, with the specific face of a man who was very accustomed to getting what he wanted and very impatient with situations in which this appeared to be taking longer than expected. They both looked at her. "Miss Calloway," Colton said. His voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but there was an edge under it now, the way cold water has an edge under its surface. "We really need to talk." "We do," she said. "Good." He started toward her. "Why don't we go somewhere comfortable and—" "Not with you," she said. "With a lawyer." He stopped. "I'm going to lock this unit," she said. "And I'm going to walk out of this facility, and I'm going to make a call. And if anyone enters this unit before I return with legal representation, I will be filing a complaint with the police and with the Oregon State Bar, and I have reason to believe the relevant parties would find that outcome very uncomfortable." She said it calmly. She said it the way she took orders at the diner. Efficient, complete, no room for revision. The taller man looked at Colton. Something passed between them. "Miss Calloway." Colton tried again, softer. "You don't understand the full situation here. There are parties involved who have significant legal resources, and the estate of Gerald Harwick is already under scrutiny. If you try to—" "I understand more than you'd like me to," Rose said. She pulled the unit door down. She locked it. She put the key in her coat pocket, next to Gerald's letter, next to the business card. She picked up the lockbox, and she walked past them. Neither man moved to stop her. But she felt their eyes on her back every step of the way down the long fluorescent corridor, and she did not look back, and she did not walk faster, and she did not let any of what she was feeling show on her face until she pushed through the front door of Pacific Rim Storage into the cold, damp Portland air and walked to the far end of the parking lot. Then she leaned against the concrete wall at the edge of the lot and let out a breath that she felt she had been holding for 2 years. She called Patricia. "I need you to help me find a lawyer," she said, when her sister picked up. "Not tomorrow. Today." There was a pause. "Rose, what?" "And Pat." She looked at the sky. "I think I need to tell you something about Mom." The next 2 weeks were not simple. Nothing about the situation was simple, and Rose had understood this walking out of that storage unit, and she had made peace with it, and she had set herself to the work of navigating it the same way she had set herself to every other hard thing, methodically, quietly, without the luxury of panic. Patricia's neighbor's husband, it turned out, was a semi-retired attorney named Warren Cho who had spent 25 years in real estate law before taking a faculty position at Lewis and Clark Law School. Patricia called him the night Rose came home from the storage unit, and he came over and sat at Patricia's kitchen table and looked at the documents from the lockbox for 2 hours without saying very much. And then he looked up at Rose and said, "Where did you say you found these?" "In a lockbox in a storage unit I just inherited." He looked at the documents again. "These are originals." "I believe so. The deed is notarized and stamped." He picked up the survey record. "This survey is signed by a county surveyor who I happen to know retired in 1994. He set it down. "Miss Calloway, if these documents are what they appear to be, and if the account in that note holds up," he picked up the James Yates note and read it one more time. "Then Gerald Harwick owned 4.3 acres of prime Portland waterfront property for the last 37 years and never lost that ownership regardless of what the courts have been told." Rose said nothing. Warren Cho took off his glasses and looked at her. "Do you know what that property is worth?" "Not exactly." He was quiet for a moment. "The Harbor District waterfront has been the site of significant development over the past decade. That specific parcel," he paused, "conservatively, We're talking about somewhere in the range of $40 to $60 million, depending on what a development rights assessment came back with, possibly more. The kitchen was very quiet. Rose put her hands in her lap under the table so no one could see that they weren't entirely steady. And it was left to me, she said. Gerald Harwick's estate's primary assets go to a series of charitable foundations per his will. The property was not listed among those assets because of the ongoing dispute and the missing documentation. The storage unit, with its contents, was bequeathed to you specifically. Warren chose his next words carefully. Whoever Meridian Asset Partners is, and whoever they were working with, they clearly believed that without those original documents, the parcel would eventually fall into their hands through the legal process. They have been slowly winning the court battle on the grounds that no original proof of purchase exists. And now it does, Rose said. Now it does. He looked at her. This is not going to be simple. I know. They have lawyers. Many of them. Good ones. This will be contested. They'll question the provenance of the documents. They'll question whether the note is genuine. They'll throw everything they have at making this complicated and expensive and slow. I know. Warren Cho looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face, or perhaps in the steadiness of her voice, the voice she had been building for 2 years in diners and motels and the offices of housing authorities, seemed to settle something in him. I'm going to help you, he said. Pro bono. I have colleagues who will want in on this. And I want you to know, he tapped the James Yates note, this is potentially a criminal matter as well as a civil one. If this note is what it looks like, there was fraud committed against the court. That changes the entire landscape. Patricia, sitting across the table, reached over and put her hand over Rose's. Rose looked down at her sister's hand on hers. She pressed her lips together. Thank you, she said. She said it to Warren. But she was thinking of Gerald, of a man she would never meet, who had left her the only thing he could, who had written her a 4-page letter full of a kind of regret that she recognized, the particular regret of someone who understood too late what they had been too afraid to reach for. She thought of her mother, June, who had moved to Portland at 26 and worked at a bookkeeper's desk and fallen into something with a man 11 years older and never told a soul, and had come home with a child and a silence she never broke. Rose thought about the photograph. Gerald and June on a beach in 1989, the year before Rose was born. She thought about what it meant to carry something your whole life and never put it down. That night, after Maya was asleep in the guest room, Rose sat at the kitchen table alone with Gerald's letter and the photograph and read them both one more time. She looked at her father's face. That was the word she let herself use, for the first time, there in the quiet of her sister's kitchen, and she looked at her mother's face, younger than Rose's earliest memory of her, and she felt all of it without trying to contain it. The grief of a mother gone too early. The grief of a father she never knew. The anger, too. The white-hot anger of a child who had grown up without and was now being told that without had not been necessary, that it had been, in some sense, a consequence of fear and timing and the cowardice of people who should have known better. She felt the anger fully. She didn't push it away. And then she felt something else. Something underneath the anger, quieter and less obvious. Gratitude. Not for the property. Not for the money, if it came to that. But for the letter. For the fact that a man she never knew had spent 6 years trying to figure out how to reach her, and had finally, in the only way he had left, reached her. For the photograph of her mother young and laughing on a beach with a man who was looking at her like she was the whole sky. Her mother had been loved, genuinely loved, by someone who had not been brave enough to hold on to it, but who had not forgotten it either. That mattered. It mattered more than Rose had expected. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and held it against her chest for a moment in the dark kitchen. Then she went to bed. The legal fight that followed was, as Warren Cho had predicted, neither simple nor short. Meridian Asset Partners had retained one of the most aggressive real estate litigation firms in the Pacific Northwest, and they came in hard from the first day, challenging the chain of custody of the documents, the authenticity of the James Yates note, the validity of the notarization. They filed motions. They sought delays. They sent very expensive letters that were designed, Rose suspected, to make her feel small and overwhelmed and out of her depth. She was sometimes small. She was sometimes overwhelmed. But she was never out of her depth in the way they were banking on. because she had spent 2 years building a life under conditions that would have broken most people, and she had come out of those 2 years with something that no amount of legal posturing could diminish: an absolute clarity about what mattered and what didn't. What mattered was the truth. What mattered was Maya. What mattered was making it to the end of each day with her integrity intact. Warren brought in 2 additional attorneys: a former federal prosecutor named Angela Davies, who had made a reputation handling fraud cases, and a young property law specialist named Michael Kim, who had a gift for making complex documentation comprehensible to judges and juries. Together, the 3 of them built a case that was careful and methodical and patient in exactly the ways that Meridian's legal team was not. The James Yates note was authenticated by a forensic documents expert whose credentials were unimpeachable. The county records officer named in the note, a man who had retired in 2015 and was currently living in Tucson, was located and agreed, after a conversation with Angela Davies that Rose was not present for, but heard about afterward, to cooperate with investigators. 2 additional witnesses came forward after the case gained local media attention: former employees of Meridian's predecessor company who had been aware of the records manipulation and had been too afraid to speak until there was something solid to speak into. The story broke in a local Portland paper first, and then got picked up regionally, and then, in the way that stories about the collision of homelessness and hidden wealth and corporate fraud sometimes do, it went somewhere larger. Rose did one interview. She chose carefully. A journalist named Sarah Okafor, who had written about housing inequality for 3 years and who sat across from Rose and Patricia's living room and listened for 2 hours without performing any particular reaction. Rose told her the truth. The whole truth, except for the parts about Gerald that were private: the letter, the photograph. Those she kept for herself and for Maya, for a conversation she would have with her daughter when Maya was old enough to understand what she was being told. The headline was, "Homeless Mother Finds Hidden Evidence of Corporate Fraud in Inherited Storage Unit," and the story goes back 37 years. It was not a perfect headline, but it was not wrong. The legal resolution, when it finally came, took 9 months. Not a courtroom verdict, a settlement. Meridian Asset Partners, facing mounting criminal exposure for the county records fraud and the civil case for the fraudulent challenge of the property ownership, agreed to terms that Angela Davies described to Rose as considerably more favorable than they wanted to give you. The property was confirmed as part of Gerald Harwick's estate, with Rose as the heir to that specific bequest. The value of the parcel had been assessed by 3 independent firms at an average of $53 million. A development company, not Meridian, who were no longer in a position to develop anything, had been in preliminary discussions with Warren's team about a lease arrangement that would generate income without requiring Rose to sell the land outright. Rose sat in Warren's office on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 9 months after she had unlocked a storage unit in a beige building on Harborview Road, and listened to the settlement terms being explained to her, and she nodded in the right places, and she asked the right questions, and when it was over and everyone was packing up their folders, she excused herself and went to the bathroom down the hall and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at her face. In the mirror, she looked at it this time. She didn't look away. She looked like someone who had been through something. She also looked like someone who had come through it. She thought about the woman who had not been able to look at herself in a motel bathroom mirror because she couldn't afford the cost of it. She thought about 43 minutes and cold showers and the particular sound of a 7-year-old asking about pancakes with a patience that broke her heart. She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She went back into the conference room. The thing that people expected her to do, the thing that the story, as people outside were telling it, seemed to require, was to immediately change her life in some dramatic way. Buy a house, take a vacation, transform visibly and quickly into someone who had always belonged to a different world. That was not what Rose did. The first thing she did was find an apartment. Not a large one. 2 bedrooms. In a neighborhood in Portland that was not fancy but was clean and safe and had a good elementary school within walking distance. She paid the first and last and deposit without having to calculate anything, and she stood in the empty living room on the first afternoon and looked at the light coming through the windows and felt something unlock in her chest that had been locked so long she had stopped noticing it. The second thing she did was sit down with Maya. Maya was 7.5 now and had spent the past 9 months at Patricia's, going to school from there, understanding that something important and complicated was happening with her mother in the way that children understand these things, imperfectly but deeply. Rose sat her down at the kitchen table in the new empty apartment. The two of them cross-legged on the floor because there was no furniture yet, and she told her, not everything, but enough, that they had a new home, that things were going to be different, that they were going to be okay, and this time when she said it, she was not performing it. She was stating a fact. Maya looked at her for a long moment with those clear brown eyes. Are we going to have a table? She said. Rose laughed. It came out fast and unexpected, the laugh of someone who had not laughed freely for a long time. Yes, she said. We're going to have a table. Can we have pancakes on it? As many as you want. Maya nodded, satisfied, and got up to go explore the empty bedrooms. The third thing Rose did was more complicated, and it took longer, and it was the thing she had known she would need to do since the night she sat at Patricia's kitchen table with Gerald's letter. She established a fund. Not a large one, not yet, but a real one. With Warren's help and the guidance of a financial advisor she was just beginning to learn to trust. A fund for women in housing crisis with children, specifically structured to cover the exact gaps she had fallen through. The deposits, the first and last months, the things that stood between a woman and a door she could lock behind her. She called it the June Calloway Fund. She did not publicize it widely. That was not the point. The point was that when a woman called a housing line in Multnomah County and was told there was a 2 to 3 year wait, there would now sometimes be another option. A quiet one. A door that could open faster. On the day the fund processed its first application, a woman named Teresa with 2 kids and a 90-day eviction notice. Rose was standing in her new kitchen making pancakes. The light was coming through the window the same way it had come through the window on the first afternoon, and Maya was sitting at the new table doing her homework, and the apartment smelled like butter and maple syrup, and something Rose had not smelled in so long she had almost forgotten it. Safety. She thought about Gerald Harwick in those weeks, often. She thought about a man who had been too afraid, for most of his life, to claim the things that mattered most. Who had circled the truth for years, hiring investigators, writing letters he never sent, keeping documents in a beige storage unit on a gray industrial road, gathering his courage one piece at a time. He had not been brave. Not when it counted, not when her mother was alive and there was still time. Rose had thought about being angry about that, and she was, some days, a quiet anger that she recognized as honest and let herself feel without letting it set. But she also understood something about fear that she had not understood before she spent 2 years learning what it cost to be afraid of the wrong things. Gerald had been afraid of rejection, of being too late, of not deserving what he had walked away from. She was afraid of the right things now. She was afraid of forgetting what the cold floor of the motel felt like under her feet. She was afraid of losing the particular clarity that came from having nothing, that razor-fine vision for what actually mattered. She was afraid of becoming someone who forgot that the woman she had been was not a mistake or a failure, but a version of herself she owed enormous respect. She was not afraid of anything else. On a Saturday in December, 2 months after moving into the apartment, Rose drove with Maya to the coast. An hour west of Portland, the highway opened onto the Pacific, and she drove until she saw a sign for Cannon Beach, and she pulled over, and she parked. She got out of the car. The wind off the ocean was cold and immediate and smelled like salt and distance. Maya ran ahead, down toward the water, arms out, laughing at the cold. Rose stood at the edge of the sand and pulled the photograph from her coat pocket. She had been carrying it, she realized, for months, and she looked at it one more time. Gerald in June 1989, this beach, or one just like it. 2 people afraid of different things, standing in the same light. She looked at the water. She looked at Maya, running at the edge of the waves, her dark curls flying in the wind, laughing with the total freedom of a child who has never been given a reason to be afraid of the ocean. Rose thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not property, not money, but the accumulated weight of someone's choices, their courage and their failures, their love and their silence. All of it handed down whether you asked for it or not. She thought about what it meant to take that inheritance and do something with it that was not just accumulation, something that moved. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She walked down the sand toward the water, toward her daughter's voice calling her name over the sound of the waves. The sky over the Pacific was the color of pewter and pale gold where the light was breaking through, and the cold wind was in her hair, and her feet left marks in the wet sand behind her. She did not look back at them. She kept walking forward. There is a particular kind of dignity that can only be found on the other side of a particular kind of survival. Not the dignity of having been spared, but the dignity of having gone through. Rose Calloway had gone through. She would carry what she had gone through for the rest of her life, and she did not think of it as a scar, but as a map, a very detailed map of every place where a floor can give way and every exit she had found, and every exit she would spend the rest of her life making sure was there for someone else. That was the inheritance she chose. That was the thing she had found inside, not in a lockbox, not in a stack of documents, not in the number on a property assessment or in a settlement agreement or in any of the systems that had tried to swallow what was rightfully hers. In herself. In the part of herself that had gotten up every morning and put on the smile and made the pancakes and held her daughter's face in both hands and loved her with a love that cost everything and never counted the cost. That part. That was what had been there all along, waiting to be found. That was what she had found.